Today we're going to talk about something extremely important that most new game developers don't even know exists, or if they do, they may barely understand how it works or what it is or why it's useful. It's also something that really is important for intermediate or experienced game developers. If you're an experienced game developer and you submit a resume without this on there, well, it's probably going to disqualify you right away. So, what is that thing and why is it so important? Well, the thing is source control, and we're going to get into why it's so important, why it's avoided by new developers, how you can get into it really easily, what all of the different options are, because now with game development, there are quite a few options, and the options are, I'd say, quite a bit different from non-game development programmers. I mean, if you ask any web developer what you should use, they're probably going to tell you Git, or Git. So, what are the options for game development? Why are they different? Why should you maybe consider something else? Now stick around. I'll show you exactly what the best options are for Unity. And at the end of it, I'll give you my recommendation for what I think you should use, what I use personally. I want to start by describing the first version of source control that you'll run into, or the one that I used first and the one that you've probably used first. And this happens usually after you've made some big mistake, you broke your project and you're trying to fix it. And you go, you know what, next time I'm going to copy my project so I have a backup of it. And you copy it and paste it, add maybe an underscore, a dash backup to the end, and you're safe. You've now got a stored, saved off version of it. So you can now continue on, and if you make a mistake, you go back to it. And every now and then, you just copy that folder and paste it. Now this kind of works. It solves some of the issues. You at least have some way to go back and undo things. If you're not doing at least this, well, then you're missing out, because while this isn't a great option, it's better than having no backup at all. The next step, though, tends to come when you're working with somebody else. You're going through this process, the copying is okay, but then you're finding that, hey, I'm also zipping up this entire folder and sending it off to somebody. So I've got to keep sharing this or sharing it around the team at the office or wherever the place is. Now, if you're in an office and you're doing this nowadays, you've got some issues, but hang around because this video is going to explain exactly how to solve those problems. But let's continue through the evolution. You set up a network share and everybody's dropping their folders now into there. You've got a backup underscore JSON, a backup underscore JSON Tuesday, a backup dash Thursday JSON. A couple weeks later, the system admin or whoever's running the network share starts to email you saying, hey, you guys are eating up a ton of space here, filling this folder up. You've got this network share that's 3 terabytes. Can you clear that up? And you start to get into this process of needing to now manage the shared folder. So you've got to start adding some rules. Maybe you only have a couple days of folders and people have to manually drag things around, clear them out, but nobody does, and it ends up being a mess where you're constantly fighting and things are getting deleted at random, and it's really difficult to deal with. So then maybe you move on to the next step. You're like, you know what? This isn't good enough. A file share isn't going to work. We need something more advanced. Let's go to Dropbox. So you upgrade to Dropbox and all of a sudden your problems are solved. The storage is remote. The files are kind of just getting replaced. So you drop a folder up and you've got the new version of the folder there, and things kind of seem like they're solved. And to be fair, it does help. It's definitely a better option. Let me cut to clarify. It's a better option than the past two options. It's still not something that I would recommend because you are going to run into issues with this. It's a little bit slow. You've got to manually control the syncing, or kind of manually control the syncing because it's also automatic. You don't know which files have synced. Some files may sync while other files are not synced. You can end up in a completely broken state a lot of the time, especially if you're using the Dropbox folder as your actual source folder and you're linked directly up to that, because as people are changing files somewhere else, one source file might update and get sent over to you, and then the other one isn't there yet. So you've still got to go through a manual process, and if that other file is not there yet, you're going to get compilation errors or other weird bugs if only half of a check-in is there. Now, speaking of check-ins, let's get to the solution, and that solution is source control. And if you're already using a source control solution, before we dive into those, drop a comment down below and let me know. I'm curious what you're using before we go into this. And if you're not using anything, let me know that as well too. I'm kind of curious to see how many people are not using any source control in their day-to-day life. So what is source control? Where did it come from? And how can you use it? In a nutshell, source control is the terminology that we use or the word that we use to describe systems or services that keep track of our different versions of code. Now, in game development, it's not just code. We keep track of code, art assets, metadata, and quite a few other things. But the source control system is responsible for keeping all of those revisions, keeping track of the differences between those revisions, and to revert back to or pull back those changes if we make a mistake or we need to undo something or just kind of look at what we've been working on. They also give us the ability to do some better distributed work. Unlike a file share, we can work in a source control system where we work on our own and then just push up the specific things that are ready, or we push up our changes as soon as they're ready with comments, history, and a whole bunch of other information. And then other developers don't need to pull the changes down until they're ready. So we don't have the issue that we run into with Dropbox, where something's up there and it totally breaks your code halfway through because you're linked to that folder. So what are these source control systems? What are your options, and what should you choose as a Unity developer? Let's start with what the options are. I'd mentioned at the beginning that web developers are going to recommend Git, and to be honest, that's probably what about 50% of your peers are using. If they're doing source control and they're in some kind of a game development place, they might very well be using Git. If they're outside of game development, they're definitely using Git. If they're doing web development or something else, well, I say definitely, but 90 to 95%. It's very prominent. It's got a giant market hold. That said, for games, there are some other big players out there, some other options that I see used because Git isn't always the best option for large art assets and really for the way that games are built and the way that the size and weight of the projects that you have. Git is great for code. It's not so great for all of the other options. So what are those other choices? Well, one of the first ones that I used was Perforce. This was a big, very popular system back in the day when I was at Sony. Everybody used Perforce, and pretty much every game company used Perforce that I knew of. There were a couples that used some of the competitors that we'll talk about, but most of the time we used Perforce, either the red version or the yellow version, and people kind of loved and hated it. Programmers generally kind of liked it because it locked files, made it easy to prevent merge conflicts, which means that if two people are working on code at the same time, imagine me and another Jason are both working on the same method of code in the same file on our own computers, totally remotely. We both make different changes and we both try to commit those. That is a merge or a merge conflict, and we have to figure out how to resolve that. With Perforce, what it does is when you want to edit a file, you actually have to check it out and you would lock the file so that nobody else could edit the file. It'd be like saying, hey, I'm working on this file. Don't make changes to it right now. It's mine. Nobody else can change it. I need it because we're going to have a merge conflict otherwise. Now, you can get around that. That's an optional thing in Perforce, I believe now, but it used to be just kind of the workflow, and it probably still is the workflow for a lot of developers. Personally, I don't really like that workflow, though. I don't like having to check things out, and I prefer being able to just work on things alongside other people. That, and when I looked at Perforce for personal use, there were some licensing issues once I got past 5 users. It started to get pricey to share projects and things, so I've kind of stopped using it. Although I still think it's a useful tool, and it's something that's useful to understand and know about, especially if you want to get into the game development industry. There are a lot of companies that use it, and if you understand how to use Perforce, it definitely doesn't hurt. It can only help. In fact, it's something that I would say is good to have on your resume. Having Perforce and just any source control on there, not just good to have. It's extremely important to have on your resume. Now let's take a look at another source control system that I used to use, but not so much for game development, and that's SVN. You'll see SVN used with Tortoise SVN, and it's pretty easy to use. It has a nice right-click context menu to allow you to check in files, or to check in an entire folder, or check out a folder. The wording here is a little bit different. You check things out, you're pulling them down, and you check them in, you're committing them, and you'll see how strange that is as we get through the whole process of source control and talk more about it. But checking in, checking out, they'll mean different things in these different source control systems. It's something kind of important to note. Really what's important to understand, though, is what it means in the source control system that you're using. And I wouldn't recommend that you go with SVN for your game development. It's not a bad option. It works okay, but it's just not the option that I would go with personally. Those are two that I don't use. Now let's talk about one that I do use, or at least that I'm using right now, and that's Unity's Collaborate system. Unity Collaborate was built into the Unity engine a while ago, and it's been kind of a godsend ever since. It's extremely easy to use and really handy. I think it's the best way to get started with source control, and it's really the first thing that I teach in all of my game development courses, because I think it's so important that game developers just get into the habit of committing regularly. And speaking of my game development courses, I've actually got some really exciting news. With Black Friday coming up, I've decided to have a huge sale. With Black Friday coming up, I've decided to do a huge sale on all of my courses starting on Monday. It'll be the biggest sale I've ever done, and all my courses will be 50% off with a special Black Friday bonus and some really cool new things you've never seen before. With the bundle, you'll get all of my courses, including the Game Programmer course that'll teach you the fundamentals of game development in Unity, and the Game Architecture course where we go into the advanced topics that you really need to build out big, full-scale games like the RPG that we're building live. The discount and bundle are only available for a limited amount of time, so if you're interested in game development and want to take your skills to the next level, I definitely recommend you check it out by clicking the link in the description and go sign up for the notification to see what kind of cool things are in the bundle and get notified when it comes out. Now, I'd mentioned that Collaborate isn't something I'm going to be using long term, and I want to explain why that is. They're actually replacing it. Collaborate is a really cool system, but it had some downfalls or some weaknesses. It doesn't support some of the more advanced features that a lot of people using source control really want, like branching, which is, I think, probably the biggest one. Branching and partial commits, probably two of the largest, but branching is by far the biggest and most concerning one for most people. So what is the new option? What are they doing? Why are they deleting it and replacing it? I think initially they were probably going to keep working on it and building it up, but eventually Unity acquired the company that made Plastic SCM, and Plastic's been around for, I think, around 15 years or so. It's a little bit older than I thought, but I first heard about it about 7 or 8 years ago working on Pantheon. Actually, I think it might have been even before that I tried it out the first time. And it was sold as a new source control system meant for game developers, or at least the advertising I was seeing was all around meaning it or building it for game developers. It was meant to handle art assets and make that a little bit easier, because if you work with artists, you know that they usually have a really hard time with source control. And it was meant to make it so that game development and source control just kind of worked together. Now, when I tried it out before, it wasn't bad. It didn't have too many issues, but at the time I was also getting really heavy into Git, so I was kind of being pulled back and forth between Plastic and Git won out because everybody I knew was using Git, and it just kind of seemed like that was the way to go. That was the flow of everybody else. There's no reason to fight against it. But now with Unity buying Plastic and then now integrating it directly into the engine, I've decided it's time to start reevaluating that. And I've been actually looking at Plastic quite a bit. And it seems to me that it's going to be possibly the new standard for Unity game development, at least. Whether or not it takes over for other game development, who knows? I mean, source control systems change, compete. There are a lot of different issues there, a lot of different things that they compete on, things like pricing, speed, performance, reliability, and then features. I don't know if Plastic has every feature that every source control system has or that everybody needs. May not. We'll see as time goes by, I guess. But this is the one that they've now switched in, and you'll see here that it's actually integrated directly into Unity. You no longer need to go download or build anything. You just set it up. It takes about a minute to create the account. In fact, I think it was a little bit quicker than creating an account and setting it up for Unity's Collaborate, which is kind of crazy. I thought it was going to take a while, but it was extremely easy the first time I set it up. The source control system seems to just work easily. Select the files I want to commit, check them in, give them a nice message, and then everybody can see the history and then pull down the changes as they want. Just like with Collaborate, but a slightly bigger UI and a little bit more going on there. Plus, we've got the ability to now branch, which I think is probably the biggest part that's going to kind of push this over the edge. Anybody who was kind of up in the air, not sure which one to use, the ability to add branching once you get past the first maybe 6 months of using source control is amazing. The first couple months of using source control, branching is not that exciting. Branching is essentially taking your project and then making a copy of it. It's a lot like making those folder copies that we talked about earlier, except here you're making it in a system that's kind of tracking that. Saying, hey, make a copy, label this copy my Jason's making a new feature branch. And it makes that copy, and it only copies and changes the things that it actually needs to. Other than that, what it'll do essentially is reference back to the original files, and in the copy it'll only have the changes, and then essentially links back to the original files or the non-changed ones. So it's a much tighter version that doesn't waste a bunch of space, but it also allows me to switch back and forth between those two really easily and then merge the changes back in from the branch into our main branch. You can have multiple branches, start branching out a ton and merge back in, or you could just use branches sparingly when you need them. Depends on your use and how your studio runs or how you like to do it yourself. Personally, I don't branch too much on my own, but every now and then I'll make a little feature branch when I need to go test something out. Unless I'm working with other developers, then I will pretty much always make a big feature branch, work on my feature, get it ready, get it fully figured out, make sure that it works, do the merge so that I know that it works with everybody else's latest changes, and then commit it so that it's nice and easy to keep it separated. And if I need to go back and change something else in the main branch, maybe I've got an emergency bug fix or something else, I can do that just by switching branches. And this is something that actually comes up a lot when you get into actual like professional AAA development, especially if you're on a game that's got a live team, something where you've got live servers that are running that you have to maintain and manage. I've done a lot of this with MMOs. You are going to need to go back to that main branch and randomly fix bugs. When something pops up that's causing all of your players to disconnect or crash, or somebody's found some weird new exploit that you've got to fix, you don't want to have to undo and copy your entire folder. You don't want to have to grab another computer or something to do the changes. You want to be able to just switch branches, go make the change, fix it, and then go back to your existing working stuff that you've been doing for the last week or two, this new feature stuff that you've been doing. But what about Git? I mentioned at the beginning that Git is one of the most popular options. In fact, I think it is still the most popular option. I still think that it's a pretty viable choice. If you want to be a game developer using Git, you certainly can. There are, however, some things that you need to pay attention to and note. First is that art assets are going to get big and bloated if you don't set up Git LFS. And Git LFS is something that you're going to need to just look into. Once you get familiar with Git and you start to get comfortable with it and you start to run into the issue of every time we check in an art file, we have an exact complete copy of it, then look at Git LFS. You're going to need to do that. I wouldn't start with it though. If you're just beginning with Git, just start with Git and kind of get familiar with it. Git has some really cool features and some really nice things to it. One of my favorite things is that you can just commit locally and then push up your changes later. That's what's part of the distributed version control system, and it's just the way that Git works. It's a really great way to work. It's a nice workflow because you can just commit things constantly locally without having to worry about whether or not they break something for somebody else and without being in a branch. It's almost like when you're working locally, you're always in a branch until you hit the push button to push your changes up. Now, when you do your pushes in Git, you actually do your merging. So with Perforce or other systems, you do your merging when you pull. So you pull down the latest changes and you have to merge them in. With Git, you have to merge them when you push your changes up. Now, that might not sound like a big deal, but when you're working with a big team and you get really tired of having to constantly fix merge conflicts every time somebody else checks something in, you start to see the value of it and see why it's such a cool feature and a really nice workflow. You don't have to worry about other people interrupting your workflow, and if you go in and make big breaking changes, you're the one responsible for kind of fixing those. It really does help, and there are some other really cool features in Git. That said, it's a little bit complex. It's definitely not where I would recommend people start. If they've never used any source control, Git's an easy way to completely break your project, accidentally delete things. When you go in trying to mess with the advanced features and fix things, it's easy to just mess it all up. So on your first Git project, one thing I would recommend, which as bad as this might sound, is that while you're working in Git and getting kind of familiar with it, if it's an actual real project you care about, also do a little bit of that copying and pasting of your folder. Just keep a version around before you make any big Git commands or you try hitting something like a rebase or some other thing that you're not quite sure what it means or how it's working, but you think it's going to fix the problem. Get yourself a backup, because I've known way too many developers who've lost a ton to Git. And it's always in those first stages, the first kind of figuring out the workflow and accidentally hitting the wrong buttons or doing the wrong thing. Speaking of the wrong buttons, with Git, you have a couple options. There's a command line interface that's somewhat popular. You'll see a lot of people talk about it. I think a lot more people talk about it than actually use it. When you go into an actual environment of developers, you'll see that maybe like 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 people are using the command line. Most people use one of the tools that are available, like sourcetree's tool or Git Kraken or Git Tower. There are a bunch of different options out there, from free options to paid options, that all act a little bit different, and I don't have any real opinion on which one's great. If anybody does have an opinion on which one is the best Git option now, by the way, drop that down below. I'm kind of curious. Now that I've gone over the options that are available, or at least most of the options, if you've got another option that you really like, drop that down below too. I'm kind of curious to see if there's something else out there that I'm missing that's really popular. I think that I've kind of hit the top ones though. But now that I've done that, I want to talk really quickly about just habits when it comes to source control, because it's easy when you get into source control systems to just make a first commit and then kind of forget about it and then not commit again until like a day later, and then 2 days later you do some other commit, and then you're committing like 1,000 files at once. And I would just like to contend that I don't think you should be doing that, especially if you're starting off with source control systems and you're working on a solo project. You should be committing almost all the time, maybe hourly, maybe at least every 2 to 3 hours. You should be committing whenever you make a change that's a significant change, where it's actually a functional change and it works. Then that's when I would commit. If I've added a new system to my game, some new thing, maybe I've added a new item type that I can pick up, a new set of those things, then I'll make a commit. If I've added just some new content, I pull in some art assets, I will make a commit. If I pull in an art package, I'll make a commit. If I make a change to a scene, go realign a scene, go rearrange things, place things in the scene, I'll make a commit. Every single time I want to commit these changes. And the reason for that is really simple. Source control gives me nice, long undo history. It gives me a history of every single commit. And if I break those commits down into the actual bite-sized chunks that they are, I have a lot better control over what I'm viewing, so I can see the differences there, what I go back to and what I change, and I can tell what's actually happened there. It's a whole lot easier to read a bunch of little commit messages that are a single thing with 5 or 10 or 20 files in them than it is to read one that's got like a giant list of stuff in there that half the things we forgot because there are so many files and so many things changed in there. And we just really won't understand what's going on with our changes. It makes it a lot harder to go back and undo things. It also makes it so that we don't have our undo points. If we're committing every time we add something new, if we change our mind, we go, hey, you know what? This item change or this inventory change, this isn't actually going to work as I get a little bit further. I can go back and undo to the point right before that and not have to worry about, oh, did I undo 10 other changes because they were all part of these other commits. And with the right source control systems, I can even cherry pick out and remove a single commit or undo parts of a commit without having to undo all of the rest of the history. So get used to source control, start to master it, and trust me, it will really make life easy for you. It'll help a lot. And when it comes to interviews, if you understand source control and you can help them with source control, oh wow, that'll really push you over the edge. If you don't understand source control at all and they ask you, hey, what source control systems have you used? And you say, I don't know what that is, it might be a disqualifier. So I would watch out, make sure that you get comfortable with it, get familiar with source control. And again, if you're interested in learning source control from me, check out the Black Friday sale. It's only available for a limited time, and we use source control in every single one of my courses. You'll learn that and a whole lot more. All right, thanks again for watching, and see you soon. Oh, don't forget to hit the like button.